Okay, so here we are again with part two of Abel's Blood, or Abel's Blood Part Two. We left off with links being missing uh, throughout natural history, but we want to examine the whole concept of missing links. So when you find that there's missing links in certain things with science and so forth, indeed they are missing. But when you come to the account of Genesis, the book of Genesis, whether you're talking about Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel, we establish the fact that they function as humans in the way that humans function today. Verse 3, it said, in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. Verse 4, and Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And incidentally, the distinction between the firstling of his flocks, that means the best that he had. And the fat means that he had already killed it and separated those two things. And that the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Now, the central theme of Hebrews 11 and 4 is faith. And that's the whole key to the chapter. And that's what we want to find out right now concerning these two. Now, we read here that they both brought a sacrifice. Now, this tells us several things. And I want you to get this. This is interesting. Number one, it tells us that there was a place where God was to be worshipped. Okay? There was a place where God was to be worshipped. They had to bring that sacrifice to a place or to somewhere. And in verse 3, Cain brought. In verse 4, he brought. And it says at the end of verse 3, unto the Lord. Okay? Indicating that the Lord was somewhere where you could bring something. There had to be somewhere, someplace where they brought this stuff. And I think it's very possible that that place was at the east of Eden in respect unto Abel and his offering. And so there was at least a good indication here that there was already a place to make an offering, or an altar was already in that place. And it's very likely that that place where God had placed that angel. You remember at the east of the garden with the flaming sword to keep them from coming back in? That had established a point of contact with God. So in verse 24, chapter 3, he drove out man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every way to guard the way of the tree of life. And so perhaps at this point, there was an altar. And isn't it interesting that God, in the initial moment that he expels man, also provides a mercy seat by which man can come back and worship him? And that mercy seat, like that seat that was in Israel, was protected by a cherubim. And the divine presence was there, perhaps in some way. Whoever would worship God would approach this mercy seat by the way of sacrifice. So there was a place where God was to be worshiped. Second thing I noticed, there was a time for worship. Verse 3 says, and in the process of time it came to pass. Now, if you take that apart in the Hebrew, it really means at the end of days. Literally, at the end of a certain prescribed time, it was time for sacrifice. Maybe God had revealed the Day of Atonement, or a Day of Atonement, a special day. Maybe this was the first occasion he recorded in chapter 4. God is a God of order. And it's very likely, if we study the later times that God operated with men, that he established a time when they were to come. I think that it's indicative by virtue of the fact that they both came at the same time. They seemingly both had information regarding this sacrifice. Thirdly, I think there was a way to worship, not only a place and a time, but a way. God could be approached, listen to this. God could be approached only by sacrifice. The children of Adam and Eve had been definitely instructed that there was a place. There was a time. And I believe this presupposes that they had also been instructed that there was a way to do this sacrifice. Now, Cain and Abel wouldn't have known anything at all about doing this if God hadn't told them, because the concept of sacrifice appears here for the very first time. And so they must have had some information from God about the time, about the place, and about how to do it. It presupposes by the very nature of the situation. They came to a place ready to make sacrifice. They must have been something there for which they could use to do it. They came together at the same time, to the same place, and they came with different offerings. But God only accepted one of them, which indicates God had already established a pattern for them. Now in Hebrews 11:4, as we read earlier, we learned that it was by faith that Abel offered sacrifice. Now, where does faith come from? Well, Romans 10:17 says faith comes by, and then what's the next word? Hearing. You cannot put your faith into what you don't know. Therefore, to assume that Abel offered a sacrifice by faith is also to assume that he heard from God and what God wanted, and he believed God and obeyed God. You see, if faith comes by hearing, Abel's faith must have come by information from God. Therefore, he must have known the set pattern that God designed. He had heard that God required a sacrifice. He believed, and the evidence was faced by doing what God said to do. There's nothing with farmers. They're wonderful people. They're not, there's nothing wrong with offerings. God, all kinds of fruits and vegetables and grain. That's great. But in Leviticus 19, I think it's in verse 24, it says, in the 4th year, all of the fruit thereof shall be holy, with which to praise the Lord. So God had times when they brought all of that to him, but you never brought the first fruits, or you never brought that fruit first. Always the blood first. The blood was first, because the blood was necessary to deal with sin before you could ever enter into God's presence. There were meal offerings, sure, the loaves, and then we have the wave and the sheaf at God and all of that. But that didn't come until first came the sin offering and the trespass offering. The blood had to be first, and then the other things could follow. Bloodless meal offerings, yeah, but the blood first to deal with sin. When Abel did what God said, he revealed his obedience, and he acknowledged his sinfulness. Cain was disobedient and didn't acknowledge sin. And so it was by faith he brought a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. And it was better because it was blood. God had prescribed this. No question about it in my mind. Otherwise, he would have had no idea what he was doing. And if this is true, it says Abel offered a better sacrifice, and God responded by making him righteous. If Abel just did that by accident, then what right did he have to be righteous? Are you following me? If it was only an accident that he brought, well, I'm a sheep keeper, I'll bring sheep. Cain thought, well, I'm a tomato keeper, I'll bring tomatoes. No. If it was a pure accident, then on what arbitrary basis would God say, Abel, you're righteous? Cain, you're not. That would be horrific to say. I like sheep and I can't stand tomatoes. But you see, whenever Abel was accepted, that means that somewhere along the line, he heard what God said and he obeyed it. Otherwise, there's no premise for his righteousness or his being accepted. And we'll see the illustrations further in another, New Testament passage. God accepts only faith. Abel believed God. And he approached God and said, God, this is what you said. And you said if I brought it, you'd forgive my sin. I believe you, God. I acknowledge. And see, this was an acknowledgement of a prescribed remedy. And Abel was basically saying, here I am. Here I am. You told me to bring this. I brought it. You said if I brought it, you'd forgive me my sin. And here it is. Cain had the same information, but he brought what he wanted. See, he brought what he wanted to bring. He didn't bring what God said bring. He did his own thing in a great tradition of his mother. Okay? Did his own thing. And his father, for that matter, Cain didn't believe God. Thought he could approach God in his own works. Thought he'd gather up the goodies that he had collected and show God how wonderful they were. How he had tilled the soil and grown all of this. And he said, here it is, God. Isn't it terrific? And you know what? Cain stands as all-time father of false religion. You know what false religion is? It's coming to God by another way than what God has prescribed. That's all false religion. Peter said in the great sermon, he said, neither is there salvation in any other. There is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. False religion says, oh, yes, there is. False religion says, I can get there because I think myself, like in nirvana. There's many, many roads to get to God. False religion says, I can get there because I sit in the corner and I meditate. False religion says, I follow the writings of Mary Baker Edie or Annie Besant or Judge Russell or somebody else. False religion says, I can do what I want and just be good. And if I have, enough good points or enough merits, I'll get there. And Cain was the father of every bit of it. God said, I have a way. Cain said, no, I'll come my own way. That's false religion. And he was the first one, the father of false religion. False religion is an invented way to God. There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof of those ways is destruction. Men always have their own way of doing things, to go everywhere, to do this or to that. Man always has a way. But the question is it God's way? Okay? Now let's look at verse 16 of chapter 4. It says, and Cain went out of the presence of the Lord, and he dwelt in the land of Nod. And the land of Nod is the very name which means wandering or roaming, and it's on the east of Eden. And you know what Cain did? He had some children there, and he built a city, and it was the first city men ever built. It was the birth of the system. Now, I need you to hear that. It was the birth. When Cain went over, said, I'll have it my way. I'll do it my way on the east of Eden. Got married, had children, and built a city. It was the birth of a system. It was the birth of the world system, which fell into the control of Satan immediately. He chose to go his own way. He walked out of the presence of God. He looked at it in verse 16. He went out from the presence of the Lord, his own will, his own way, his own volition. He walked away from God. Don't feel sorry for poor Cain because God didn't accept his fruit. He knew what God wanted. He just didn't abide by what God said. He did his own thing. And the question always comes up, how could God have judged that way when they hadn't been told? Listen, people, they had to know. They had been told. God's righteousness is not arbitrary. It is based on obedience to his prescribed plan. It was not ignorance. That was not the issue. It was a willful sin on the part of Cain. Abel was righteous. Cain wasn't. And to support that, I want to read verse 12 of 1 John chapter 3. Maybe you knew 1 John talked about Cain and Abel. Well, it does. And in verse 11, for this is the message that you heard from the beginning. Always talking about the beginning. That we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was out of the wicked one. Did you catch that? Who was of that wicked one. Oh, he identifies Cain with Satan. This is 1 John. That's talking about motive. And killed his brother. And why killed he him? Why did Cain kill Abel? Because his own works were evil and his brother's righteous. You see, it wasn't arbitrary on God's part. To disobey is evil. To obey is righteous. It's just that simple. God gave them what he wanted, and they either obeyed it or they didn't. He gave them, he told them, he gave them instructions. You say, well, how do we know that sacrifice had been revealed? We have to assume that by faith to some degree, but I think there's a little indication here, not a lot of indication, just a little. It's interesting that when Adam and Eve were found by God, God said, in effect to them, I'm going to take care of you. Look at verse 21 of chapter 3. For Adam also and for his wife did the Lord make coats of skin and clothe them. Now that's interesting. Here the Lord in action speaks about sacrifice. 4 things are intimated here by the fact that God made cloaks of skin for them. That's number 1. Sinners need to be covered. He made cloaks of skin for them. Sinners need to be covered. Number 2, it couldn't be a human manufacture. They already had made, fig leaves and aprons. And God said, no, I will design the covering. Number 3, God had to provide it himself. Number 4, it was obtained only by death. An animal had to die. And so in this very limited way here, perhaps there was an initial disclosure of the importance of sacrifice for covering. And that's really the only hint we have of it. But we know by virtue of the fact that there was righteousness and unrighteousness, that there had to be a standard by which men could be judged this way. So we believe God revealed his standard. So faith, then, now mark it, faith presupposes divine revelation. So when a guy comes along and says, well, I believe in believing, well, that is stupid. Or it doesn't matter what you believe, just believe in anything. One guy believes in this, another believes in that. We all believe what we want to believe, and we're all going the same way. Faith presupposes a divine standard. Do you know something? Cain believed himself. He believed in himself, and he believed in the wrong thing. In Hebrews 9:22, it says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. I don't care what you believe, there is a standard. And God said in Leviticus 17, it is the blood that maketh atonement for the soul. That's a standard. That's God's revelation. That's a disclosure from God. And you got to get this. It is absolute. There's no substitution. People say, man, you're narrow-minded. You're all in the clouds. You this, you that. Well, I'll be that. But it could be a broad mind that tell lies, but that doesn't help anyone. This is God's standard. This is why I speak. And he is already, God, he was ready. God set this standard. He was ready for the sacrifice. The indication of the firstlings and separated the fat indicates he's already killed the animal. So he knew what he was doing. Abel knew what he was doing. Now, here's where the life of faith begins. And let's grab this thought. The life of faith begins with the sacrifice of sin. You got to have a sacrifice for the sin. It begins with believing God that you're a sinner, that you're worthy of death, that you need his forgiveness, and you accept his revealed plan. That's the beginning of the life of faith. You need the Lord. You're worthy of death. You need forgiveness. And you accept his plan that he has revealed. Nobody lives by this. Very few accept this. Listen, if the doctor comes in the room, in the hospital room, and says, you have cancer, you could say, don't tell me that. I don't want to know about that. Tell me I have a cold. He says, well, that isn't going to help you. This is the doctor saying, it's not going to, if I tell you you have a cold, it's not going to help you. I've got to tell you what you have so you can get the stuff. You can get into the treatment. You can get what you need. If you've got a disease, we want to tell you what it is. And so here in Genesis chapter 4, the highway to the cross is firmly established. Here is the first lamb, Abel's lamb, one lamb for one man. Later on in the Passover, one lamb for one family. Later on in the Day of Atonement, one lamb for a nation. Later on at Calvary, one lamb for the world. And here's the first lamb. The way to the cross begins to be paid. Abel starts it with the first lamb. And so Abel brought the right sacrifice. He acknowledged that he must bow to the truth of God. He must acknowledge that he's a sinner unto the sentencing of death. He has no excuses. He has no merits to plead. His best is, as Isaiah called it, filthy rags. He can only believe God. That's all he can do. And he has to bet his life that God is right. He has to bet on God. And that God means what he says and God's going to do what he says. But Cain was not so convinced. Cain believed in himself. And that's the dumbest thing anybody could ever do. Not only that, he was a hypocrite. If he'd only truly believed in himself, he wouldn't have showed up at the altar. If he really believed in himself, he wouldn't have shown up at that altar. Not at all. He was not only a believer in himself, he was also a hypocrite. He cloaked his rebellion in religious activity. Here I come, God, with my little sacrifice. See? He was patronizing God. Let's look at Jude 11. Interesting little verse. It talks about the way of Cain. Everyone's talking about the way of Cain. Do you know what the way of Cain is? It's self-will, unbelief, disobedience, all couched in religious pretense. Religiosity, an abomination to God. The Pharisee and the publican, I know you've heard of this. The Pharisee goes into the temple, and of course he climbs up on the podium and he says, I thank thee, O Lord. I'm not as other men, checking around to see who's looking and stuff like that, making sure they were watching. I give my tithes and all that I have, and I do this, and I do that, and I do this. And the Bible, interestingly enough, says he prayed within himself. It's for sure he wasn't talking to God. Dear me, oh me, he was talking to himself, for sure. Over in the corner, there was a young man on his stomach with his face in the dirt. And he's saying, God, be merciful. Be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said, that man went home justified rather than the other man. Religious hypocrisy. Isn't it amazing how people in a building or in a certain setting are so religious? And I do this, and I do that. And they have all these titles and all this other stuff. But then there's a person who comes and says, Lord, forgive me. I'm a sinner. And God is saying, they go justified. I don't know what these other folks are doing. And people are dying every day in these systems. The world system created by Cain and overtaken by Satan. This system of trying to check the block and look a certain way and sound a certain way and do a certain thing. And I'm going to be like this person or be like that person. I want this type of ministry or that type of ministry. And God doesn't care anything about that. The only thing he cares about is your relationship with him. What's your relationship like with him? Awesome. So Abel offered a better sacrifice. It was a better sacrifice because it was done in his obedience. God said, do it this way, and Abel did it. It was better because it was in faith. He believed God. It was better because he was willing to do it. He did it because he wanted to do it. And he brought his very best. Okay? It says he brought the firstlings, the best one he had. He didn't bring the second best, or okay, we'll just do this because I want to keep that one for me. He brought the very best he had. It was the first place. It was like, man, this sheep here is first place, first prize. And he brought that. Cain brought of the fruit of the ground, and he just got some of it together. It was just whatever he can pull, he just got it together. And so Abel, by faith, was brought to offer up a more excellent sacrifice. Now, because of that, he was able to obtain righteousness. That's the second point. He was able to obtain righteousness. Now look at verse 4. And Abel, he also brought the firstling of his flock and the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but Cain and to his offering he had no respect. God didn't respect that. It's amazing how people come to God and they say, well, they've been going to a certain place for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, whatever, or the inception. And God said, I don't respect that. I don't respect none of that mess. God didn't respect Abel, for what was in Abel. God didn't say, Abel, I like you better. I've checked both of you over, and Abel, you're the best. God didn't say that. Abel, I just like the way you walk or the way you handle yourself. God didn't say that. Abel, you're just. You really come on strong. God didn't say that. Abel, Cain, you have a funny limp. God didn't say that. There are people who think God is so superficial that he really cares about what they look like. No, he doesn't. Or their disposition. I don't know. There's nothing at all in the text to indicate